We were joined from Melbourne by the Coalition's Kelly O'Dwyer and in Canberra by Labor's Shadow Assistant Treasurer Andrew Lee. Welcome to you both.
Great to be with you.
Kelly O'Dwyer, on the deficit tax, why is it okay for the Coalition to break an election promise, but when Labor did it, Tony Abbott said it brought our democracy into disrepute?
Well, Emma, I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. While there's been a lot of reportage about a deficit or a debt tax or a levy, we've seen that reportage be quite different in all of the papers, and the budget yet hasn't been delivered. It will be delivered.
Are you saying we're not going to get such a tax or a levy?
Well, the budget's going to be delivered on the 13th of May, and I haven't seen it yet, Emma, so I can't tell you exactly what's in it. But the Treasurer will deliver it on the 13th of May, and at that time we'll know exactly what is part of the budget, rather than the fevered speculation that we have seen to date. We also know that Labor is running a pretty strong scare campaign on all sorts of issues, but I don't know that that's terribly helpful or constructive.
But hold on a minute, back to the deficit tax. The Prime Minister and the Treasurer have both had ample opportunity to deny it, and they haven't done so. In fact, the Prime Minister has been at pains to defend the idea.
Well, look, all Prime Ministers and Treasurers, you know, a couple of days out before a budget, and I think we're something like 10 days out before the budget now, they don't rule in or rule out anything that may or may not be in the budget. I mean, this is pretty standard
practice. It's a step further to defend it, though, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's your assessment of what's been done here. I think the fundamental point to note here is that we have been having a discussion over the last little while about the legacy that we have been left by the Labor government, and that is a pretty serious one. They trashed our budget, they refused to fix it, and they locked in spending in the future years.
Let's go back to the question, though, because otherwise we're going to run out of time, and it was about breaking promises. Andrew Lee?
Well, Tony Abbott had the opportunity over past years to say that he was going to increase income taxes. Or he could have said promises don't matter all that much because situations change. He did neither of those two things. He crisscrossed the country talking about the importance of promise keeping. In fact, at one stage he said that there should be no new taxes without a new election, which does make you wonder whether he's about to take us back to the polls. Fundamentally, Mr Abbott needs to stand up to the test that he set for the former government, which he castigated for putting in place a temporary fixed price period on the carbon price. I'm really concerned we're seeing the unravelling of the carbon price, which increased the taxes on pollution and lowered the taxes on work. Mr Abbott's discovering that once you forego the substantial revenue from the carbon price, now he's going to have to increase taxes on work. And that's the wrong recipe for an Australia in which we should be seeing more people in the workforce, but less pollution.
Andrew Lee, in government, Labor spent money it didn't have in every one of its 6 years in power. How can you now criticise the Coalition for trying to be more responsible with taxpayers' money?
Emma, you know that if you look around the world, that Australia's public finances are in extraordinarily good shape. When we left office, debt around 1/10 of GDP, and we were one of just 3 developed countries to avoid recession through the global financial crisis. In half a year in office, Joe Hockey has managed to double the deficit, adding $68 billion to the deficit through things like going soft on multinational profit shifting, not being willing to pursue a modest Labor measure to more fairly tax the superannuation of people with more than $2 million in their super balances. Collectively, those decisions have doubled the deficit. And now the government is turning around and saying, well, it's going to have to be those with chronic disease, people with disabilities, low-income Australians who bear the burden of the fact that Mr Abbott and Mr Hockey haven't been willing to fairly tax multinational companies when they try and shift profits to other jurisdictions.
Kelly O'Dwyer?
Well, what Andrew Lee didn't say is where Australia started on the journey when Labor was actually elected. And we started in a very strong position because we'd paid back all of Labor's debt. That's the reason we went through the global financial crisis very well, and that's the reason we're in a stronger position today when you compare us to a number of other economies. But what Andrew fails to appreciate is what people have been saying all along, people including organisations like the International Monetary Fund, and that is that we have a huge spending problem. Labor got us into a huge spending problem. Of the 17 most advanced economies that they looked at recently, they said that Australia was increasing spending at the fastest rate. Now that's ahead of Canada, that's ahead of the USA, that's ahead of France, that's ahead of Germany. I just don't think that Labor gets it. They're not accepting any responsibility for the position that they left us in. They talked about delivering surpluses. They didn't deliver one. In the 6 years that they were in government, in fact, they delivered the highest deficits, 5 of the highest deficits that we have ever achieved in our nation's history, and they added huge debt burdens to future generations. Looking forward, up to $667 billion that we know about if we do nothing today. Now that's why the Commission of Audit was so important in being able to provide recommendations to government. It was to actually look at how do we go about fixing this problem that we have inherited by Labor. And the fact is, Labor don't want to be part of the solution. They in fact want future generations to pay for their recklessness.
Well, Kelly O'Dwyer, we wouldn't be facing this so-called budget emergency if John Howard hadn't got the ball rolling on middle-class welfare. Things like the unmeans-tested baby bonus and the family tax benefit.
Well, we'd actually delivered surpluses. We could afford to pay for the money that
So it was okay
being...
to introduce those measures just because you could afford them at the time because we were in a mining boom?
Well, we were... Sorry, I mean, the point I was about to make, Emma, is we were balancing the budget and doing more than that. We were, in fact, putting money aside. So after we'd paid off Labor's 96...
Aren't the structural problems with our budget on account of the fact that this middle-class welfare started under John Howard?
Well, if you just let me finish, Emma, I was just saying after we'd paid back Labor's $96 billion that they left us with, we'd put $45 billion aside, which forms the Future Fund today, which is a net asset. We actually delivered a net asset to the Australian people. The Labor Party certainly have not done that. They have, in fact, left future debt for future generations, and they have locked in spending. The truth is that they actually received more revenue, despite what they have said in the past. They received more revenue than the previous coalition government, $70 billion more. It's just that they doubled spending. That's why we are in the situation that we're in today.
Emma, there's a number of points to respond to there. The first is that, as you correctly identified, the proceeds of mining boom Mark 1 were largely squandered by the Howard government because it was locking in spending that was not sustainable. So in government we made the decision to end the baby bonus. We got little help from the coalition there. Joe Hockey at one stage comparing it to China's one-child policy to scale back the baby bonus. And we means-tested the private health insurance rebate. It's still coalition policy to take away that means test, despite the fact that the private health insurance rebate's one of the fastest growing areas of government expenditure. Now, Kelly refers there to the recent IMF report, but of course that report is based on Joe Hockey's recent fiddling of the figures. While we were in office, we kept a 2% real spending cap on government spending after the global financial crisis.
But you didn't achieve it,
when
Andrew.
He came to, and we achieved it every year.
No, it's 3.5.
And when Joe Hockey became Treasurer, he took that cap off, and of course when you take that cap off then you see a big blowout in spending. So the IMF is assessing Joe Hockey's budget update, which is a worrying budget update. It's an extraordinary Treasurer who can manage to double the deficit in just 6 months.
I mean, what Andrew
but
said
is now
is simply not
going
correct.
back to trying to balance the budget off the backs of the poor. And what really worries me about this Commission of Audit is that we've had 20 years in which CEO pay has risen twice as fast as average wages and 3 times as fast as the minimum wage. But what does the CEO-dominated Commission of Audit say as their recommendation? Well, they think there's a wages problem and it's the minimum wage that needs to be cut. And this is a sort of dystopian vision of Australia, I think, and one that hurts the poorest and
I
most
didn't realise
vulnerable
this was
Let
a
me
monologue.
bring,
in the area
let me
of
bring Kelly
rising
O'Dwyer.
inequality.
Let me bring Kelly O'Dwyer in here because you have made a number of points which clearly Kelly O'Dwyer is taking offence to. So let's have a listen to what she has to say on this.
Well, they talk about, you know, this cap that they put in place, this cap on growth in real spending. They say, wasn't it fantastic? We put this cap in place and it was 2%. The problem is they didn't abide by it. On average, it was 3.5%. And when you look beyond the forward estimates, when you look in
After
the years
the global financial crisis,
2017,
it was adhered to.
well, Andrew, let me finish. I listened to your monologue. In 2017, 2018, in the fifth year, beyond that forward estimates period, in fact, the real growth was 6%. Now, that's going to be encapsulated in this budget this year, which is a tripling of their supposed cap. Now, they want to talk about budget forecasts. They want to talk about projections. Well, let me tell you, they, for instance, projected that they were going to get a surplus almost every year. The deficits that they started with in some years were $12 billion, which turned into $44 billion. They had heroic assumptions in there regarding growth. We really, coming into government, got real with the Australian people.
We can't ignore the fact that there was a global financial crisis during their
but that's
years.
only, I mean, that was only part of their spending. I mean, they doubled spending ongoing. It wasn't just a one-off. It was entrenched within the budget. And this is the problem that we need to address today.
Sure. Now let's talk about some of the issues that we assume will form part of the budget thinking on the GP co-payment. Andrew Lee, when you were a PhD student at Harvard, you argued co-payments were sensible because it would make people think twice before going to the doctor. What or who changed your mind on that?
Well, Emma, I've changed my views since university days, as have many other people. And fundamentally on this, I think it's the evidence coming forward from health professionals who weren't represented on the Commission of Audit, like the Australian Medical Association, the Doctors Reform Society. And they've said that the real challenge in Australia is that if you deter people with chronic disease from going to the doctor, you end up having more people in hospitals.
But can I just point out what you had said in a paper back then? Yes, it was 10 years ago, but you were a PhD student and you argued that, as economists have shown, the ideal model involves a small co-payment, not enough to put a dent in your weekly budget, but enough to make you think twice before you call the doctor.
Emma, a co-payment might have been right when the Hawke government proposed it in 1990. Maybe it was right in 2003. But we've seen massive increases in out-of-pocket costs in Australia. And we know when we look across developed countries, the real challenge for Australia is we have too many people in hospitals. Now, if you curtail access to private health care, then you end up getting into a situation where you blow out a number of people in hospitals, and a hospital is far more expensive than a GP. I've spoken to a large number of GPs in my electorate, to friends who deal on the front line as doctors with people with chronic disease, and I'm strongly persuaded that a GP tax would be a bad idea, and that we ought to listen to the health experts on this.
Is there anything in the Commission of Audit, Andrew Lee, that you do support?
I think the Commission of Audit suggesting that Tony Abbott shouldn't go ahead with his parental leave scheme is wise indeed.
They're I don't
following,
think it says
of course,
quite that, does it?
Well, yeah, they don't go as far as the Productivity Commission. When we asked the Productivity Commission whether a wage replacement scheme would be appropriate, they said no, that wouldn't boost productivity or participation. And you've got independent experts like Saul Eslake saying the same thing. The reason for saying that the flat rate scheme is better is that it fits also with Australia's social safety net, which is either given more to the most disadvantaged or had flat rate payments across the board. This is an unusual payment that gives the most to those who have the most. It was described by the Liberal Party as being appropriate because parental leave is an entitlement. So much for the end of the age of entitlement. If you're a millionaire family having a baby, then the age of entitlement's just beginning, it seems.
Now, I want to move on because we are running out of time. Let's talk about the corruption inquiry in New South Wales. It's claimed the scalp of the state's police minister today, and this afternoon, Kelly O'Dwyer, your fellow federal MP Karen McNamara, has been accused of electoral fraud. Given what's already happened to former Assistant Treasurer Arthur Sinodinos, how unsettling is all of this for your government?
Well, look, my understanding is that both Karen McNamara and also Senator Arthur Sinodinos were called as witnesses to ICAC, and both of them have been involved in presenting evidence to them but have not been directly accused of any corruption. And I think that's an important point to make. There have been other allegations made at ICAC regarding corruption. That needs to be fully investigated, and those people who have been found to be corrupt need to face the full force of the law. Corruption is a terribly corrosive aspect to our democracy and our society, and it's not something that any one of us can stand for.
And just finally and briefly, former federal independent MP Tony Windsor has called on Clive Palmer and the other federal independents this week to push for a federal corruption inquiry. I'm wondering from you both, would you be in support of such a move? Andrew Lee.
I certainly think it's an idea that's worth exploring, Emma, and people have noted that at the federal level it's the standout on not having a corruption panel. I do think that, as Kelly has rightly said, corruption is insidious because it cuts into confidence, confidence that people can rely on those with whom they're doing deals, that contracts will be fair, that they can rely on getting a fair go from the government. And also as a former judge's associate, I have a strong view that no one should be above the law, but that everyone's entitled to the presumption of innocence. And that certainly goes for the coalition members that Kelly mentioned before.
Kelly O'Dwyer?
Well, look, I certainly think that there has been no allegations of corruption federally, and if there were, then obviously they need to be investigated by the appropriate bodies, and my understanding is that that can be investigated currently. So my view would be any criminal activity should be investigated, and anybody who does the wrong thing should face the full force of the law.
Kelly O'Dwyer, Andrew Lee, thank you both very much.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Kelly.
Terrific to be with you.